The Islamophobia Network.
Salam salam, ishtanin, singaye. I stay forgetting our intro. This is the Samovar podcast. It's been a while since we've done this, so if I'm a little rusty, you guys gotta cut me some slack. Welcome. For those of you who've been listening for years, we appreciate you. For those of you who are just jumping on now, because this seems like a fun, interesting topic, we say hello to you as well. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Dawoud. I'm in from Southern California, but born and raised in the DMV. And I got two amazing guests with me, both scholars. I'm going to let Ali introduce himself first. Dr. Ali Olomi, you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Diz. My name is Ali. I'm also based in Southern California, and I'm a professor of history working on the Islamic world.
And then Nura, would you like to introduce yourself too? Dr. Nura Sediqe, everyone.
Guys, Salam. It's been a while. I missed everyone. I'm excited for this conversation. I'm a professor of political science and public policy at Michigan State University. So I'm kind of Midwest based, but love to hang around the West Coast as much as I can as well.
Honorary West Coaster.
Yeah. We'll give you the title, but we'll give you the Bay Area title. You're not a SoCaler.
Absolutely. No, Bay Area.
Yeah. You're an honorary Fremontee.
Absolutely.
I'm very intimidated, to be honest with you guys. I got two doctors here, and I'm just an average Joe. And we're talking about a heavy topic today. We're actually going to be discussing Islamophobia, and I got some experts on it, so this should be a fun conversation. But first, what is Islamophobia?
Well, I wanted to sort of read you something off an Excel of a survey I fielded in 2022. Just give you a teaser to. So basically, in the survey, at the end of the survey was 1,500 people across the United States, and those are general opinions about American politics and immigration, with a few questions sprinkled in about Muslims, not a ton. The last question was, hey, when you think of Muslim men, what is one thing that comes to mind? It was an open-ended answer. And then I asked the same thing of when you think of Muslim women, what comes to mind? So let me read you a couple things about the Muslim men. Terrorist, dominating. The concept of other people being frightened due to stereotypes. Beards, oppressive, terrorist. They're okay, cool. Ramadan, Hadrat Muhammad, peaceful farmers. Most Muslim men that you've met throughout my life seem to be a bit on the arrogant side. You guys, something I'll ask you guys about. Towel-head terrorists, dark people, being mean to their woman. And then this one was interesting. I often think of Dearborn, Michigan, where there is a large Muslim population. They seem well-educated and successful. As someone who loves Dearborn, I can appreciate that one.
Yeah, I feel like you answered that one.
Was one of them dark? Huh? Did they say dark ones? What did they say?
Dark. They said dark.
Dark.
Let me see. Yeah. Dark. Yeah, dark hair.
Oh, okay. I mean, the one of us that has hair is kind of dark. The other one, your beard's dark, Ali, so that works.
Yeah, there's that was the main. Yeah, dark. That was an interesting one. And that's come up a few times. For women, this is crazy. Submissive. Souls that are used by the Muslim men. A woman who covers her face. They have a soft heart. Women who are forced to hide due to religion. They worship the wrong God. They're beautiful why they wear the hijab. Women that mostly stay at home and care for the kids. Their poor treatment from men in third world countries is astounding. Weak, quiet, good, submissive to male family members, submissive, quiet, submissive to their fathers and husbands, submissive, stuck up, powerful. So there's a gamut, but the word submissive came up so much. I was genuinely surprised. And I
Yeah,
think, yeah, what do y'all think about some of those responses?
So you didn't, just to put a little bit of context there, in addition to the sort of raw data that you collected in open-ended answers, you then tabulated the number of answers and you were able to produce
Yeah,
clusters, right? So like what was the number
the
one
word cloud.
cluster or yeah, what was the number one cluster for men and maybe what was the number one cluster for women just so that people can get an idea of what showed up so frequently.
For the number one for men was just the word man.
Uh,
There's the one of the most common after that was terrorist,
oh wow.
controlling, and terrorism. And then for woman, the number one answer was woman. Then second was Muslim woman, and the word cloud. The third was submissive.
Wow.
Submissive came up 35 times, separately from sentences or like standalone words.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm.
So you
And
see
I think that
very different depictions.
yeah, I think this is a really good entryway into letting people see how Muslims are perceived by the wider American population. And even without giving a definition of Islamophobia, we already sort of get a glimpse of what Islamophobia looks like in those answers, right?
Absolutely. I'm a little mad that no one said shawarma or talked about our good food. There is no mention of shawarma or no mention of mantu. It's
I
all
wonder I wonder if the answers would be different and more culturally if you asked, what do you think of Middle Eastern men and what do you think of Middle Eastern women rather than
mm,
Muslim? So like the
yeah.
religious connotation there, right? Once you say Muslim, it probably has a different flavor, to use the food metaphor there, than
but
Middle Eastern.
see, that's interesting that you say that, right? Because we live in like the biggest population of quote unquote Middle Eastern people here in Southern California are like Iranian,
Mm-hmm.
right? And from what I've seen, they're lumped in with other Muslims, even if they're not Muslim, right? They're considered Muslim,
All
like
Middle
even though,
Easterners are considered Muslim in some way, shape, or form, even if they're not Middle Eastern. I mean, the first victim of the post 9/11 moment of anti-Muslim bigotry was a Sikh man,
mhm.
right? He
Yeah,
was
just
in
because he was
because
wearing a turban.
perceived to be Muslim because he was wearing a turban, and I think
Exactly.
that's a
Exactly.
Yeah, so
Well,
I
I
don't.
was thinking with the halal food movement, like everyone in New York City is like, let's just get halal food. That, I would have thought that food would have been like the equalizer, but maybe if I asked, that's a great thing to ask, actually. I'm going to make a note of that, mental note, to ask about food in the future. But I say that jokingly, but the reality is like there is like a dehumanization that we see. And so to Dawood's first question of what is Islamophobia, I think there are so many different academic definitions that we can use. I think if you strip it down to what it is a process of dehumanizing Muslims, um, and creating a stereotype and caricature of them in a lot of ways, like as a civilizational antithesis to who folks in the West are with these stereotypes. And to me, the best way is to think of it as in public opinion, the anti Muslim sentiment you see when you ask people, how do you feel towards Muslims? That is like the public's opinion of Muslims, the media's depiction of Muslims, and the overwhelmingly negative depictions of Muslims that we see, whether it be in Hollywood movies or in news segments or news articles, and then the structural element, government policies, where we tacitly endorse the idea that Muslims um, are someone that we need to surveil more than other Americans because of ties to foreign entities that are not loyal to America, and those dimensions. It's sort of like the three prongs that I think of when I think of Islamophobia.
That's really good. That's a really thorough definition of Islamophobia.
Um,
It doesn't.
Sorry, what was
Is
that,
that
Nora?
like, does that make sense? Because I feel like it's such a big concept, but I think it permeates everyday life that, you know, um, it's both complex and simple at the same time. It's complex in the sense that there's no easy solution to necessarily remove Islamophobia from society.
Mm,
It has such a deep-seated history.
right. I think well part of the problem with that, and we're jumping ahead to addressing stuff, right? But I think part of the issue with this is because Islamophobia is a politically useful tool, right? It
Hmm.
is one of the more acceptable forms of bigotry. So if we just defined Islamophobia in like the most basic format as anti-Muslim bigotry and bigotry towards Islam through fear, prejudice, and a caricature of stereotypes, just that alone, it is the most acceptable form of bigotry in the West, right? Like
Oh, 100%.
you can, if you swamp out the word Muslim for any other race or category, it would cause immediate outrage. But there's a level of acceptability of bigotry towards Muslims, an imagined Muslim, not a Muslim individual, right? Because then liberals get angry. But if there's an imagined Muslim, an abstract Muslim, you can really sling anything at them without facing repercussions. A prime example of this being Bill Maher, right? Bill Maher has a lucrative, thriving career despite being an open Islamophobic bigot for the past, what, 30 years or so?
Uh-huh.
And that remains true of a lot of political figures, of public figures, is that they can be Islamophobic without facing any sort of repercussions because it's politically useful and socially acceptable to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking out of experience, I remember almost 10 years ago, right, when Trump was first running for office, I had some clients that came in and they brought up politics and then they brought up religion and they asked me if I was Muslim and I said yes. And then one of their responses to me was, "Oh, well, you're one of the good ones, right?" Now, imagine if that was like one of my black coworkers and like, "Oh, you're black. Well, you're one of the good black." Right? Like
Mm,
that would not have been deemed acceptable, but because they're like, "Oh, you're one of the good Muslim." It's like, "Oh no, they're giving you a compliment, bro. They weren't saying anything racist. That was them being nice to you, right?" Like it's very accepted to make underhanded snide comments like that and people not bat an eye to it.
And the biggest one recently is this: you come on a show with everything going on with escalating conflict in Gaza. Do you condemn Hamas? The fact that the wait, so you inherently think I support um, a, an organization that the U.S. has defined as a terrorist organization? So do I condemn them? Most Muslims you ask are like, what, Gen Z? They probably didn't know what Hamas was until October 2023. What are they going to it's like, hey, do you condemn like XYZ? I didn't know they existed. What am I condemning? Like, there's
mm.
like, hold on, wait a second, right? Like,
Well, I
and
think
so
that
I
that
think that,
speaks to
yeah,
the political utility of Islamophobia, right? Because we're looking at a
yeah,
cyclical relationship. I mean, that's the Gen Z might be surprised by that, but millennials aren't surprised by that because that's what we grew up with. Post
Hmm.
9/11 moment was,
absolutely.
do you condemn Al Qaeda? Do you condemn the Taliban? Do you condemn ISIS? Those were the all refrains, and then they went away for a little while because liberals allied themselves with Muslims in the sort of anti-Trump moment, and then once it became politically useful again, then you have, do you condemn Hamas, right? So the political utility of Islamophobia here is really important, and it's why it is so normalized and allowed to continue in the sort of social strata that you've identified, Nura, because the political aspect of it, right? It serves a particular purpose of otherizing Muslims, of creating a sort of image of a fifth estate, of what is they call fourth column, fifth column crap, of dual loyalties. It's all about the political usefulness of Islamophobia. The fact that you can have senators, politicians, presidents run on openly Islamophobic terms speaks a great deal to the way that it functions in Western and American society.
Yeah, like I think back to one of the the ways they try to discredit Barack Obama was
He's
he's
a
a
Muslim.
Muslim, right? Like as if being a Muslim disqualifies you for
Right.
being, you know,
And can we
a
talk real
leader.
quickly about John McCain's answer? Because it's like always lauded as like the
Yeah,
best
right.
answer. Look how
Absolutely
Republicans were so
horrifying.
that's when Republicans were decent. Not anymore, but look how decent they were. When when the woman says, "I believe he's a Muslim, I believe he's an Arab," John McCain's response is, "No, he's a decent man." As if being a Muslim or being an Arab immediately means you're an indecent man, right? Like, can we just talk about that? That framing in of itself is really revealing. It tells you something that the decency of John McCain is still imagines the
Yeah.
Arab and the Muslim as an enemy and an other. Because the righteous answer would have been, who cares?
Yep.
Had he been
Mhm.
Muslim or not, it doesn't. That would have been the answer. But no, no, no. He's not a Muslim. He's actually a good guy. That is not a good answer. But it's the fact that people laud it as a good answer. I think should tell us something about where Islamophobia works, even amongst the so-called, decent folk.
But where does it start, right? Like I think for me at least, right, the most of the Islamophobia I saw was post 9/11. And granted, I was a child pre 9/11, and I was still a child during 9/11, so like I didn't really ex get to experience like much or remember if I experienced anything like that. Like what does it go back to, the Crusades where they were calling Muslims Saracens and whatnot, like to quote Kingdom of Heaven.
Yeah, I mean, anti-Muslim bigotry is as old as Muslims have been around. We find it in the medieval era. The Crusades are a particularly harsh moment. But Islamophobia as an actual modern form of bigotry can be traced to about the 19th century, where we had really the precursor, which is Orientalism. Now, we need to be clear here. Islamophobia is a type of bigotry. Orientalism is an intellectual, artistic discourse. And while it imagines the Muslim as an other, it is not inherently bigoted. In
Hmm.
fact, a lot of Orientalists would go to great lengths to talk about how much they love Islam and how much they love Muslims and Oriental culture. In fact, the Orientalists of the 19th century wore turbans and they mastered Arabic and they studied the Quran. But what is implicit in both of them is the idea that the Muslim is an other, an existential other that can never be Western. Never mind the fact that the so called West and the so called Islamic world have always been intertwined. There is no Renaissance, there is no Enlightenment without the Islamic world, right? These things don't exist. But it always sort of imagines there's this place over there called the Orient, and people who live there are Orientals. And those Orientals are inherently different from us. And every definition it gives about those Orientals, there's an implicit definition of the self. So, if the Oriental is superstitious, then we, the Westerner, are rational. If the Orientalist is barbaric, then we, the Westerner, are civilized. If the Oriental is backwards, then we, the Westerner, are progressive. So there's implicit self definition that comes with Orientalism. By about the 20th century, we see the first use of the word Islamophobia. It comes out in 1920 or so from a French thesis, Islamophobie, which is a reference to bigotry towards Muslims. In the American context, Islamophobia, that is bigotry towards Muslims, will mesh in the 20th century with anti blackness specifically. And the reason for this is that the oldest manifestation of Islam in America is Black Islam.
Hmm.
About historians like Diouf argue that something between 30 to 40% of enslaved Africans were Muslim. Islam is as old as Christianity in America. It's been there from the very beginning. And so it gets enmeshed in a sort of black religion. The Nation of Islam, the temple of the Moorish temple, all those sort of ideas emerged during the 20th century. And you can see this particularly in the caricature of the Muslim man. The Muslim man is almost always exclusively seen as a sexually violent threat. right? The first iteration image of the Muslim man in cinema comes from the 1920 movies The Sheikh. And the Sheikh is a rapacious, sexually aggressive Arab man who's lusting and thirsting, to use the modern word, after a white woman, a white British woman, if I'm not mistaken, right? That idea of the rapacious, sexually violent Muslim man is just mapping on the threat of black male violence, right? Black sexual violence. That image of the black rapist is now merged onto the Muslim. By the late 20th century, would say about the 80s to the 90s, it then takes on overtly anti-immigrant component. And that's when we start to see Muslims as uniquely a foreign other, right? The early colonial Americans still imagined Islam as part of America, but a black part of America. By the late 20th century, and I hate saying the late 20th century because it's like calling the 90s the late 20th century is a very painful thing to say for 90s and 90s
No,
babies,
it's
right?
so dated.
That is, when you say shit like the late 20th century, it hurts us a little bit in the gut for us
We're getting
millennials,
old,
right?
bro. We're getting old.
Yeah, I know. Like for me, like don't you dare call the 1995s the late 20th century. But the late 20th century, we have anti-immigrant sentiment. Muslims become foreign, right? What is interesting about Islamophobia is that it continues all these older trends while adapting new ones. So Orientalism is still there, anti-blackness is still there. It just adds on a new layer of anti-immigrant sentiment. And then in the post 9/11 moment, it's the security anxiety. Muslims not just as a foreign threat, but a foreign terrorist threat. And the examples of this are purely just watch TV. Just watch TV and you'll see from the Sheikh, you'll see 24. From the Sheikh, you'll see Homeland, right? That transition of Hollywood from the early 20th century to what's showing up in the 21st century gives you all the various iterations of how Islamophobia manifests in these different ways. A really overt example of it in 2023 is the way in which Democrats tell Muslims that they have to vote for Biden or that Trump will deport them.
Hmm.
Implicit, of course, in that is the idea that Muslims are foreign,
Right,
right?
exactly,
Not
exactly.
that they've been part of American religion from the very beginning.
It's an
Well,
inception. Yeah.
we'll see how good you survive under Trump. We'll see what happens when he deports you. I'm like, motherfucker, I'm from Virginia. Can I say motherfucker on this podcast? I just
Yeah,
did.
man. Yeah.
Okay. Motherfucker, I'm
Explicit
from
warning.
Virginia. Where are you going to deport me to?
Yeah. Well, I don't know, man. I don't know if you're welcome back in Fairfax, brother.
No, no, I'm banned from anywhere near the capital.
That
I'm
sounds like a
banned from, I'm
story.
sure.
Oh dear. Yeah, my colleagues did they call it a sentiment analysis, where they essentially like they looked at the key newspapers in the United States, and then they did this in Europe, they did this in Australia, and they picked some articles. It's Eric Blake and his co-author, and these are really like rigorous scientists.
Mhm,
They're not from the Muslim community, and they essentially look at like they have this comp sci model where they look at how negative sentiments are about like a headlines. They pull headlines,
mhm,
and overwhelmingly, overwhelmingly, this the book came out 2 years ago, I think. When Muslims are in the headline, it's negative,
Hmm.
and this is up until 2 years ago. And I mean, I think it was worse than they originally even hypothesized. And then they compare it to Canada. They compare it to England and Australia, and the only place where it's not as negative is in African countries.
mhm.
No shock to us, but like the level of negativity in the sentiment in newspaper headlines
Yeah,
is to me like one of the most egregious. And they have a book filled with examples. Like it's like we're
right.
not. This is not even anecdotal. These folks are just taking computer science methods of the highest form today, big data, doing the analysis, and they're finding the same thing that you're saying. So like it's like however you triangulate it, whether it's how reflecting through sort of like the historical process, or even just like downloading the data sets now and looking at it, it's so pervasive that it's shocking when people want to turn a blind eye to like how bad the reality is for us.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just if you ever want to see the evidence of this beyond just the social science, just Google Muslim man and then click the news link. and you'll see it
Oh,
very
man.
overtly that either Muslim men are related to some type of negativity, like violence is happening to them, or they are perpetuating violence in some way, shape, or form, and that's over. I mean, the fact that criminals exist in all societies, but Muslim criminals must be identified by their religion,
Hmm.
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
you're not going to see a lot of headlines that start with Christian man kills his family. You're not going to see that. You'll see man kills his family. But when a Muslim does the exact same action, the exact same act of criminality, it is attributed to his Muslimness or her
Hmm.
Muslimness. And that's the key to, that's the Orientalist root of Islamophobia, right? Is that whatever the Muslim does has to be attributed back to their religion because their religion is different from our quote unquote Western religion. That's the seed of Orientalism that still exists in the 21st century, right? Because it's not they don't have other motivations. It's only can be attributed to their religion.
See, Floridians will
That,
have an issue with that. They're going to be like, well, when someone from Florida does something, you guys just Google Florida man.
that's
Florida man.
hilarious.
In fairness, it's because it's Florida.
Yeah, it's true.
It's the only
I'm just,
that's the only acceptable form of bigotry.
It's against
Bigotry
Floridians.
towards Floridians. Sorry,
Hey,
Floridians.
I'm with it, man.
I
I'm
have a
all
whole
for.
thesis about how America would be like 45% better if we just banished Florida into the Atlantic Ocean.
I'm not endorsing this opinion. I love
I
people in
am
Florida.
I'm
They make
starting the Civil
great
War on the
coffee.
Summer War podcast.
I'm with you, man. I'm all for banning
We don't have any
Floridians.
Floridians in Summer War Network anyway, so we can get away with it, I
Yeah,
think.
exactly. Who
Uh,
cares? We don't need them.
oh dear.
No, but you brought up an
How?
interesting thing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. What were we?
Oh, go ahead, Diz. I'll bring it up after.
Well, it's because like you brought up how like everything is centered around like Muslim men is tied to their religion. But what does it seem for like Muslim women, right? Like
Mm.
I, I can't speak from the experience of a Muslim woman because I'm like a self-identifying Muslim male, right? So I can only speak to like my experiences of, and I can get away with people thinking I'm Hispanic or Greek or Italian, some kind of Mediterranean and not Muslim. Granted, most people when they see me, they think Muslim, but you wear a hijab, Nora. Like you're very openly Muslim, and it's like that's a huge identifier. Like, how does Islamophobia affect you?
I will say I was introduced to Islamophobia very young, and I'll date myself. I think it was the summer of 1990 or 91 when my mom wears hijab too, and I was like 4 or 5, and this guy pulls up to us at the railroad, and in Ohio, I don't know how it is in California, but you stop and you look around and you go sometimes at certain railroads when it's smaller. And so she stops, and the guy's like, roll down your window. She rolls it down. This is like our first year living in America. He's, you effing sand and go back to where you came from, you effing sand and I'm sitting in the back like, what just happened? This guy's spewing. This is in the height of like just when the Gulf War started. And then so then my mom rolls her window up and we try to drive off and he starts following us erratically. And then she finally sees the cop station. She pulls over into the cop station and he flies by. And that wasn't the first time. I think we got followed at the mall once, and then the cops actually the security guards had to call the cops. Once it was a big truck. Like there were several instances when I was little where it was like, "Welcome to America, Sadiq family. Like this is the kind of people you're gonna see." And it was every time my mom was driving, this would happen. And I don't think they were used to women in hijab driving. And so at an early age, I knew that I was like that there was a different stimulus value that came to being a Muslim woman, with some that would not always engender positive attention. And to be honest, like I think I wear it with pride. I think there's so many stereotypes you dismantle when you walk in the room and you speak, and they don't really think like they're surprised by it. But it is interesting to see just the level of vitriol people will throw to a stranger. Like we don't know these people, and they're like My mom has little young kids with her, and they're still willing to kind of speak to her a certain way, right? And this was all pre 9/11. So it's an interesting arena. Um, at the same time, Muslim women are pitied and given a chance, then Muslim men are not. So it's complicated. So with the Excel, like the open-ended answers I was reading, they're like women are submissive. Women, I feel bad for Muslim women. They're I wrote an article where my research team and I we looked at legal cases, and in a lot of immigration cases, Muslim women sort of talked about most judges took pity and accepted their asylum cases because what they would say is like, I won't be treated well at home. So this sort of played up this stereotype of like the danger Muslim women face as a means to stay in the country. And it's interesting to see, we think of like the courts and judges as objective. They're not. It's interesting to see how in their judicial decision making and the opinions, how they talked about Muslim women. And they took empathy on them in a way that they didn't necessarily afford the men. So it's complex because in some ways, because we're perceived as submissive, the legal system will look at us differently than they do men. But also, we're the first targets. Wearing hijab makes you super visible. So Muslim women with hijab really do walk life in the U.S. different than Muslim women who don't wear hijab. It doesn't make them better by any stretch of the imagination. It just means that their experiences are different. And so there's like a different level of like consciousness and self-awareness you have about being Muslim because
Mm,
in certain instances, you're like a walking target.
totally. I mean, what you're talking about is really important there because what we see with Muslim women is that they're simultaneously a threat and a victim at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? They're a victim because they're quote unquote submissive. They're being forced by their parents. They're being forced by their husband to wear a hijab. They're oppressed, right? And at the same time, they're a visible threat because they're a visible marker of the other wearing the hijab. There's some brilliant scholarship by UCLA, Shireen Razak, that talks about specifically the veil as rejecting the colonial gaze. The hijab, the veil, all of that rejects the colonial gaze, and as a result, is a threat, which is why the states like France need to ban it, and why
Yeah.
places in America, Muslim women become simultaneously the target of violence, that is, the ripping off of the hijab, physical attacks, and the target of sexual fetishization,
Hmm.
because it's the act of taking off the hijab is about white male sexual pleasure, which is why so much of our Netflix series that involve Muslim women involve at some point the Muslim woman's hijab coming off, because the taboo of the hair is enough to eroticize, to sort of sensationalize it, right? I mean, even there's that firefighter show. I don't know what it's called. It's on like Fox or something, and it's like a really overt example where there's a Muslim hijabi firefighter, and like
She
she's
takes her hijab
saving
off.
people, and her hijab falls off, and like all white men are like, make a wall around her, hide her and it's like they don't quite understand that that's not how the hijab works. Like it's not
That's
a like
amazing.
she doesn't lose her superpowers. She's not suddenly naked because she's not wearing her hijab. It's a preference, right? Like no Muslim woman is suddenly gonna be like, "Oh my God, no, my hair!" Like that's not how that works. But that is an example. Like that's a very liberal framework of look, we good Americans, we've got her back, and we've hit her. But implicit within that is the idea of the nakedness of her, right? Without the hijab, and you can see this in American erotica. Mia Khalifa, it spawned a whole. It's the right one, right? I was about to say Wiz Khalifa. I always get them
No,
mixed up.
That's hilarious.
There was a risk when I said it. There was a risk when I said it. There was like 50-50. Like it's gonna be
The
either
fact that
one or
you
the
know
other.
who Wiz Khalifa is also is
It was
pretty
50-50
impressive to
there,
me.
y'all. But 50-50, Mia Khalifa, not Wiz Khalifa, it spawned the whole genre of hijab pornography, right? So that's the idea, is that the Muslim woman is simultaneously threat and victim. And so she becomes the target of eroticization, the need to save her, or attack. And not like that is Muslim men don't experience that. As shitty as we get it, there's like a whole nother level of messed up that Muslim women have to deal with because of all these weird gender dynamics.
Can I tell you a funny story?
Yeah.
I was at a front row at a comedy club at an improv. Do y'all know who Ari Spears is? Am I gonna get canceled that I went to an Ari Spears show?
I don't know who that
No, is
is.
Ari Spears
Okay,
being
well
canceled?
well, he might be. I'm not sure. I never know. With like I basically went to the show last minute, sat up front. Um, he's um he's a black comedian, funny, does good impressions. And you know how comedians are at the front row, they ask where you're from. So he gets to my table with me and my friends, and he's like, "Where are you from?" I'm like, "Oh God, what answer does he want?" Because when you dress like this, they don't want to hear Ohio. I'm like, "I grew up around
Mhm.
here." It's so like, "Where's your family from?" Afghanistan. He goes, "Whoa."
Oh no.
He goes, "Kaboom." That's all he
That's
says.
so messed up.
Kaboom.
He's a
That's so
boom?
messed up.
Kaboom.
Kaboom.
Oh, the boom. Oh, what
Kaboom.
the? Oh,
Kaboom.
kaboom.
And
Oh,
like, and then he's like, "Ma'am,
Like an
I'm just joking." He's
explosion.
like, "Y'all, if she leaves the room, be careful." It basically implied a bomb strapped to me.
It's
And I
messed
was
up.
like, this is new. And like it was like I was like, I don't know if it's the hijab or the fact that I said Afghanistan, but when I said Afghanistan, his eyes bugged out of his head. And he's like, "Are the rest of y'all from Afghanistan?" They're like, "No." And he's like, "I don't know how you hang out with her." And he's just and then he said something else and the audience was kind of like, oh, okay, all right, because he kept pushing the kaboom narrative. But I was it was like funny and also awkward at the same time because I'm
Right.
like, it's been a while since I've heard kaboom. And this was just 2 months ago.
Yeah.
oh,
So
Well, I mean,
it
I
wow.
think
is it's
the hijab definitely plays as a role. I mean, he identifies the other in the crowd.
Yeah.
yeah.
Ohio was
And
not an
then here's
acceptable
like
answer for him.
no. And then here's Afghanistan and then enter like the music, the tabla playing in his head and then
Or that's when the
suddenly
imperial imagination comes into play,
exactly.
right? The
Listen,
sight of violence.
to be fair, Ohio isn't an acceptable answer for most people in the
No, it
country.
isn't. Sorry,
Yeah,
no.
yeah. Sorry,
Us,
you know.
I claim Michigan. It's okay. But this shows that even for Afghans, right? I think particularly for Afghans, with the U.S. invasion in Afghanistan, Islamophobia is particularly like rife in targeting Afghans because even if you're not, like you were saying earlier, Ali, even if you're not like religiously practicing or observant, or maybe you're not Muslim at all, if you're from Afghanistan, it's gonna haunt you. You just have to say Afghan, and suddenly you get the same reaction, whether or not you've been to the mosque in the last 10 years or not, you know? So I think when you think about like, well, how does Islamophobia, I think to me is like, how does is Islamophobia worse for Afghan than other Muslim majority countries? I'm curious what y'all think.
I think it's certainly any country that has been part of the sort of geopolitics of America, part of the imperial imagination of America, is going to have it bad. So I think, for example, Afghanistan, Yemen, Palestinians, these people are going to stand out. Egyptians, for example, without a doubt will face Islamophobia, right? But that's not the same level of like, oh, you're automatically a terrorist, right? I think when it
Yeah,
comes to Afghans, Yemeni, the Palestinians, people who are part of the imperial enemy, so to speak, that the
yeah,
United States has gone to war against.
Mhm.
Those
Iraqis.
are those are bad
yeah,
Muslims.
right.
Iraqis, right? Exactly. Bad Muslims automatically, right?
Yeah.
And this goes to a really useful framing. If anyone's like interested, there's a really great scholar, Mamdani, that writes about good Muslim, bad Muslim, and he gives a really interesting analysis of how Islamophobia works politically,
Mahmoud
arguing that
Mamdani?
yeah, Mamdani is brilliant work, political scientist and anthropologist, really, really brilliant, good Muslim. Though his recent article on Gaza is a little bit iffy, we'll say, but his work on Muslims in the Cold War is very useful. Good Muslim, bad Muslim is such a useful framing because it helps us understand that the imagining of the Muslim and prejudice towards the Muslim is rooted almost exclusively in American political interest in that. The good Muslim in the Cold War exists as an anti Soviet warrior. That phrase is how Osama bin Laden was described: anti Soviet warrior, right? Not terrorist, anti Soviet warrior. When the American geopolitics changes, where the Muslim goes from being a political ally to being a political threat, they now become bad Muslims. The same person, Osama bin Laden, goes from being anti Soviet warrior to anti American terrorist. That flip of the exact same person, his ideology never changed, his level of religiosity never changed, his identity never changed. What changed was America's orientation towards him. And I think that's a really useful way of understanding how Islamophobia works as a political weapon. And
Yeah.
that helps us understand the 21st century, what's going on now, the world we're living in, and whether things will change in the future. They will, when America's relationship to Muslims changes yet again.
I mean, you bring up an interesting point, right? Because like when you talk about is it going to change in America, right? It reminds me of things like anti-blackness and
Right.
being like prejudiced towards like Latino Americans, right? How does Islamophobia relate to other forms of bigotry and prejudice?
You want to take this one, Nura, as our resident race scholar?
Dear. I mean, I we talked about it a little bit earlier. Well, one, racism is like the primary feature that was constructed even with the slave codes before the country was a country. We had slave codes where intentionally we imbued cultural meaning into something that didn't exist. Slavery existed outside the US without the concept of race, but in the United States, we imbued meaning into this concept where we dehumanized Africans, we placed meaning, and then we separated them through a series of institutional rules and codes. And then we replicated that where we called them uncivilized and brutish, incapable of their own rule. It was first used on the Irish, then it was used on indigenous folks and African Americans, and you see it with Chinese laborers in the late 1800s in California. And you kind of see that systemically by the design of this country and our desire for to like have cheap labor, we tend to strip people of their humanity. And so you see that with immigrants and with Latinx folks, and now you see that with Muslims. And so, like, the racism at its very foundation was a necessary tool to prop up the American political economy. And in that way, it's so permeated that it's so easy to draw on because we know it. I show, like, there is this thing, like, there's a shark in the water. What is racism? The racism isn't the shark, it's the water, it's everywhere. And so, for those of us, it's so embedded that for even for folks who like read about it and think about it on a daily basis, it surprises you how easily it's connected. So it's all interconnected. The same system, depending on the moment in time, it will target African Americans, it will target Indigenous folks, it will target like Latinx folks, it will rear its ugly head with Asian Americans, and now with Arab Americans and Muslims. And so, depending on the time and the political context, but that same foundation is there. They're uncivilized, there's something uncouth, and like they're not human in quite the same way that white Americans are.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. The way in which all forms of racism are enmeshed in one another is an incredibly, incredibly important analysis. And I think the talking about it as the shark in the water, that's really useful because it does permeate everything. For historians, I think like we think of race as an organizing principle for social relations, right? It's a way of creating and maintaining hierarchy, which are then maintained through cultural reproduction, through legal reproduction, etc., right? But it's fundamentally about social relations, right? The microphysics of power and the macrophysics of power. The way that the state creates race and the way that we create race interpersonally with each other, right? So race as a way of organizing social relations is important for understanding Islamophobia because once we recognize race as that, as organizing these social relations, then we can recognize that uh, Islamophobia is a form of racism. It's not just bigotry, it is a form of racism because Muslims are racialized. They're racialized because you have to create the social relations, you organize that. And in order to do that, you can't just say, oh, Muslims are people that live over there. You have to racialize Muslims. Islamophobia is a form of racism, right? Once you create Muslims as a racial other, not an intellectual other, not a social other, but as a racial other, then you can place them within the hierarchy of American life, right?
Mhm.
Without that, they're abstract. You have to racialize, which is why, as we pointed out, that the first victim of Islamophobic violence was a Sikh man, right? Because the Muslims are racialized as other. And that racialization of Muslims goes hand in hand with anti blackness, right? And not
Mhm.
just in the abstract, but in the quite literal mechanisms. The war on terror security apparatus, the USA Patriot Act, etc., that emerged in the post 9/11 moment was first tested and perfected on the black community. Everything, the surveillance of Muslims, the demonization of Muslims, the detention of Muslims, the interrogation of Muslims, the um, creating of the Muslim man as the monstrous, right? That he is an inherent threat, the stripping of innocence. This is a crucial group. There are no Muslim children. Think about any sort of representations of Muslims you saw in the past 30 years and think if you can remember Muslim children being depicted. And generally, it's no. Very rarely do Muslim children show up. That's because Muslims are not granted innocence, just like black people aren't granted innocence, right? We think here of the various young black kids like Tamir Rice who are violently killed
Exactly.
by the state, but
Exactly.
they are not described as children, but as young men, right? So all of that, it starts with the state practicing, developing, and using it against the black community, and then extending it to other communities who are racialized. So this is one of the things. If you want to liberate America, if you want to end Islamophobia, you tackle anti-blackness. That's the mechanism, right? It's not just the moral thing to do. It's not just the ethical thing to do. It's literally Muslim survival rests on our solidarity with the black community. Not only because black Muslims exist, right? It's the oldest Muslim community in the world, but literally the mechanisms that are killing, demonizing, and imprisoning Muslims are the mechanisms that were developed against black Americans.
As we're winding down, I know this is going to be a big like
Oh.
ask question,
Uh-oh.
but how do we address Islamophobia as a community, right? So like, what do I do as like an average Joe who, isn't a professor of Middle Eastern studies or, political science at one of the bigger universities in America? Like, how do I, as a normal person, address Islamophobia? I'll let either one of you
Well,
answer
I
that.
mean, you on your own are a source of great Islamophobia in America. No, I'm
What
just,
have I done, man? I'm over
I,
He's
here
doing
I thought,
Dawoud
blasting
right now.
stereotypes.
Look at his shirt. Just
Yeah,
show
dude,
your
look,
shirt to the people.
I'm blasting. I got my Afghanistan and Palestine shirt. I got some gold chains. I got a nose piercing. Like, I'm what is it?
you were not
Changing
helping.
stereotypes. I'm
I'm
changing
just kidding.
stereotypes, man.
Just kidding.
I'm the hipster Muslim, dude. I got
I'm not
tattoos
sure
and
the
shit.
if the F boy persona is really helping with stereotypes too much. I'm not sure that's the change of image that we're looking for here.
My
Or
bad,
maybe
bro.
it is. Maybe we say screw the innocent look. Let's just embrace our complexity and messiness in all its beautiful forms, right?
You just call me messy, bro. I'm uh, I'm a little offended here.
Maybe subtly, subtly.
I
It's a
wasn't very
compliment
subtle,
wrapped in something spicy.
right?
There's
Right?
a compliment wrapped in a lot of insults.
Yeah. There were some things I would say to you, but we're family, so I'm gonna keep that to when we get off the air.
I know your mother. Be careful.
It's true. No, but like I know personally, right? Like when I see things, right? Like I call it out, right? Or I try to educate like coworkers or friends who don't know many Muslims about like Islam, or like I'll answer questions and I'll send them your articles, like those are things that I do personally, right? To like help navigate through like this Islamophobic world and make it less Islamophobic.
Hmm.
But are there things on like a bigger scale that we could do?
So complex. I think to me, one of the biggest things is just humanizing Muslims. Like, I don't need you to know that Muslims pray 5 times a day or that we have the 5 pillars of Islam. I need you to know that we hurt like you hurt. We're scared of things the way you are, and that our general daily lives look a lot more like yours than you believe. Like I bet you that I eat frosted flakes the same way you did when you were a kid, and I was upset when there was raisin bran at home. Like a lot of things, I think that the humanization is what they take away from us. Like to
Hmm.
what Ali was saying is the innocence of children, right? Like if people really had empathy and didn't like get immediately fearful, like that would do a lot. Um, and that's why I think arts and culture matters so much because it makes something relatable a way that we don't. Like the fact that even Drake says he has his mixtape where he says something, Ana Habibi blank blank, and he just says the word Habibi. It's like Habibi things, right? Suddenly everyone's running around saying Habibi. And honestly, that can do more to dispel Islamophobia than me telling you like how many chapters there are in the Quran because like, you're just using an Arabic word, demystifying it. It's from some pop artist you really like, and you're like, oh, I can relate. It's relatable, and I'm not saying that's the solution, but I'm saying that humanizing folks matters a lot. And I think if we really centered the fact that we just want folks' humanity recognized the same way yours is, that's really what's central to this. A lot of this is systemic, and what we're seeing now with everything going on with the protests to bring awareness to what's going on in Gaza is people just trying to humanize the sheer human loss that Gazans are experiencing. And I've seen more people from different faith backgrounds empathizing and hurting with us, like genuinely grieving. It's not even in protest. I'm seeing people grieving when they see the images, and it's humbling to see. I'm like, oh, people actually care this time in a way that I don't think I've noticed. So I have to hats off to the TikTok generation because these new folk kids are really doing a lot in terms of just humanizing experiences.
Hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think humanizing is at the interpersonal level. Humanizing is important, and educating people is incredibly important. Letting people know that Islam is not a foreign other, right? Emphasizing that it has been part of the fabric of America, and you're part of this society, whether you claim Americanness or not. It's entirely up to you, but you're part of this fabric of society. So I think at the interpersonal level, yes, humanizing is really important, but also recognizing that at the structural level, no amount of humanizing will ever result in change. Right?
No,
You have to
well,
kind of sit with both of those, that complexity.
yeah,
Like at the individual level, humanizing. At the structural level, you can't convince the state you're human. It just doesn't work. How do we know that? Look what's happening to Gaza. Palestinians have been emphasizing their humanity for 100 days. And has it, in any way, shape, or form, stopped the United States from sending bombs to kill Palestinians? No. Because at the end of the day, if the state has determined you are not human and not worthy of dignity, then no amount of you talking about your personal lives and whatnot is going to change it. The state is completely unaffected by the human component, right? That's just how the state operates. And so at the individual level, we humanize with our friends, we humanize with our colleagues, we humanize with the people we meet. At the state level, you organize like labor organizes. You don't care about the state's empathy for you. The law will never empathize with you. You don't need the law to empathize with you. You must coerce the law to be obedient. And the only way you do that is to organize as labor. This is my lefty coming out in me. You organize in solidarity with black internationalist movements. You organize in solidarity alongside workers' movements. You withhold labor. You employ boycotts. Islamophobia dies when it starts hitting people's pocketbooks. Islamophobia dies when Netflix starts losing money for constantly stripping hijabi women of their hijab and making Muslim men into terrorists. Islamophobia dies when the politician has to spend extra money in order to win his race. When he goes, damn, that was a costly race. I may have won it, but it was a costly race. Like Biden can win 2024, but you've got to exact a cost. You got to make it hard as hell for him to win. Otherwise, the lesson he takes is I can keep doing more of the same. So you organize like labor does. You boycott, you strike, you stand out, and you make a lot of noise, and it doesn't matter if people get annoyed. Only when you can do that and you do it in a coalition of others, then you can start to kill Islamophobia as a form of racism. Because, I mean, humanizing, the reality is that at the individual and cultural level, black people have been humanized, right, since the civil rights movement. But let's talk structurally. Has it stopped the police from killing black people?
No.
It hasn't, right? Because the structure doesn't give a shit. It doesn't matter how many, the same officer that's listening to rap music and that's watching black TV and going to Dave Chappelle's show still sees that black kid as a threat, as not his neighbor, as not his classmate, as not his son's friend, but as a threat. And so, like, for me, structurally, you take a militant stand of boycotting, striking, and making there be a political and economic cost for bigotry.
BDS, baby. I fuck with it. Right? Am I using that acronym right?
Yeah.
Boycott, divest. What's the S
And
stand for?
sanctions.
Sanctions. Boom. I'm all about it, baby. BDS for Palestine. McDonald's
I
posted
mean,
on
McDonald's
Twitter.
just released that. Like, did you
Yeah.
see it, Nura?
Oh,
McDonald's
what did they
released a
release?
statement just yesterday, I think, where they're
Mhm.
like, they posted a video and someone was like, "Yeah, we're still boycotting," and McDonald's released a statement said, "We are very dismayed with the misinformation. We don't support any atrocities," and that is an indication that something is happening, right? They're
Absolutely.
feeling
Absolutely.
something. They're feeling
The
something.
pocket's hurting a little bit, the
Yeah, the
Saudi.
second the pocket hurts, then they start to care. Because at the end of the day, it's not an ethical thing. It's a
No,
cost
it's
analysis.
economic,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it's a cost
And it is
analysis.
so entrenched. I think
Yeah.
that's why when there was like a signing of something about the Biden administration signed something into law, combat Islamophobia, I was like, that's actually dangerous. This is like,
Yeah.
we see it as a good thing. We can't trust that it actually gives more legitimacy to the tentacles of the very instruments of surveillance that harm our communities. Um, but this makes me happy because the McDonald's, I never thought that they would actually acknowledge what's going on. So, all
Granted, it
right,
was
the
the
Golden
McDonald's of
Arches.
UK. It was the
Yeah, it was the
McDonald's of
McDonald's of
UK, but we'll
UK.
take a win.
We'll take a
Well, I mean,
win
the
where we can.
UK organizing has been a little bit more intense than our boycotting here in the US, but we're getting there.
Yeah. We're trying.
Our
We're trying.
labor has just woken up in the past couple of years. We're looking at a very militant labor movement,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is quite nice. We're looking at real strikes happening, real boycotts happening. And then I saw people running for that, what is a Stanley Cup for Starbucks, and I lost all hope in humanity.
Oh
Oh, yeah.
dear, the Valentine's rush. I was like,
Oh,
are we
God.
really running after a water bottle?
That's what I thought. It's
It's a
just a
Hydro
Just a
water
Flask,
bottle,
water
man.
right?
bottle. What
Am I
is
not
this?
like I'm not missing anything, right? Because I was confused. I was like, it's a
L-
It's
water
just a
bottle.
water bottle.
Listen, man, it's a tarmus, and
It's a
our parents,
tarmuz.
yeah, our parents have had those for
We've
decades.
had samowars and tarmuz for ages.
They're just trying to
We're
be
the
more like
Stanley
us,
Cup
man.
Network. Where
I swear, dude,
TSN is
yeah.
the Stanley Cup Network.
Oh no, please
No,
no.
no, 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 no. The Swifty Network.
Absolutely
I,
not.
I, I don't know which one is worse. But I don't know about you guys. I know, like, this is a conversation that I think we can go on about for hours, and it's
Yeah.
still, we'd barely be touching like surface level. Um, I do appreciate your guys' time for coming on and your expertise on this subject.
Thanks
If
for
there's,
having me.
And
you
so
know,
You'll
for
never see me
all
again. This
maybe
was my first and
we
last appearance. No,
got
I'm just kidding.
no. We missed Ali. Can we just say this is the first time Ali's been on the podcast? You've seen Ali
I
on
prefer
Facebook
behind the
Live and
scenes.
YouTube. And, we hope now that, the people
No,
will
no,
give
no. Don't
incredible
begrudge my
feedback.
points. I'm every podcast you've ever heard, every video you've ever seen, my tentacles have been all over it in some way, shape, or form. I'm a behind the scenes person.
We missed your voice, so
Well,
we got your voice
Glad to be
and
here.
your expertise.
shameless plug for Ali. If you guys want to hear more of Ali, he's got his Patreon and his podcast, Head on History, on iTunes, Spotify, and on Patreon. So look up Head on History. So check that out if you want to hear more about him. You can catch Nura on
Absolutely.
all her socials. Nura, shout out your socials.
You just find me on the TSN page, follow the TSN page. I would say with organizing, Ali's also part of the Afghan diaspora for equity and progress. So maybe we should shout out if ADAP is doing, you said organizing. So for Afghans doing organizing work, they should come to you, right? And contact you if they want to get involved with on the organizing element of this.
And I think if they are really looking for someone to give them a real clear glimpse of how racism works in America and the political attitudes of Americans, they can find no one better than yourself, Nurajan.
You will
I let,
every little bit will find us on social. We'll follow the TSN page. We'll put more of this up and some of the clips, and maybe I will put some of the Excel comments onto a post so
I
that
would
people can see
really
that it's
love if you
real.
can put some of that on Instagram. I think like
I think I'm going to.
or
I will
maybe
put it
like
as
be like
private post.
maybe we should start it as a poll, like guess what the number one answer was and then reveal it. Like
Yeah,
something along
and then
those
reveal it.
lines.
I like that. Okay,
yeah, but they're
that's a
gonna be
great
they've
idea.
already listened to this now, so they know the
That's
answers.
true.
Hopefully, you've already listened. For those of you that are interested in joining TSN, please feel free to DM us. We're looking for new people to join on. So shoot us a DM. And you can find us on our socials at Samovar Network on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok at Samovar Network too. So shoot us a DM. If there's any topics that you guys would like for us to discuss, any guests that you think would be great to bring on to the podcast,
Or Nura.
yeah, right. Or if you just want to talk to Nora in the Samovar Network DMs about like questions you have about political science, shoot them over there too. But we appreciate you guys for listening to us. And if you could share this with your friends, we would love it. And hopefully, if you stop an Islamophobe, you let us know. All right. All right. Love you guys. We're out.
The Samovar Network.